Umbiagindi, Sangitamu. So this is my presentation right here. Talk in it, not about it. My journey as a Tewa language learner and now starting to be a teacher. Umbiagindi, Sangitamu. Na'o Americana Chawen Samuel Villarreal Catanach. Na'o Oa Chawen Ogui. Meet me. O Suwenge Owinge Iweri Omu. O Suwenge. So I just introduced myself and I used a little bit of sign language along with it, and I'll sort of go into what that's all about. Like Ine mentioned, I got my master's degree in American Indian Studies from Arizona State University a couple of years ago, where I focused on language. I'm currently the director of our community's Tewa language department, which is brand new. We're about a year old now. And I am the father of an almost 3-year-old. His name is Makoa. And so just to give you a little bit of, I guess a little bit of background or context for where Posuenge or Poaki is situated. This is a map of the 19 pueblos of the state of New Mexico, as well as Hopi out in Arizona. And if you look at the orange, those are all of the still remaining Tewa-speaking pueblos that exist today. To the north, you have Okeowinge. They switched their name in 2005 back to their traditional name. You have Santa Clara, San Ildefonso, Nambe, Tesuque, and Posuenge. And then actually out in Hopi, you have a Tewa-speaking village as well, and they went out there a long time ago. And right now, our department is working to travel to each community and record speakers there. And I'm especially interested in going to Hopi because I've been to Hopi, but I've never heard Hopi Tewa being spoken. I've heard that it's the old version of Tewa and that it's very different from what we have today. And so my path into learning my language, this is sort of just a general overview, but I grew up here at Posuenge Owinge. And I attended a day school nearby of another community, one of those communities that you saw up there. And I remember growing up that when I was going to this school that I was the only person, not only from Poaki, but the only person who looked like I did, meaning not as brown as everyone else. And so when I was going there, I was being exposed to a lot of cultural things that I wasn't necessarily being exposed to here in Poaki because my dad is from Santa Fe and my mom didn't grow up traditionally. She doesn't speak the language. There's a generational gap there. And so when I went to this school, I was being introduced to a lot of cultural things and a lot of things that are part of my culture, but that I wasn't familiar with, which were all good things. But at the same time, and this is a term that's been brought up several times by speakers, is lateral prejudice or lateral oppression and things like that. And it basically means people within a group being prejudiced towards one another or not being nice to one another. And so now I have the terminology for what that was back then, and it was like being called white boy or like not fitting in for not being Pueblo enough or whatever it was. And back then I didn't have enough of a sense of identity to really comprehend what was happening or to how to process what was happening or what to do about it, other than either keep to myself or act out. But overall, I really enjoyed my time there. And so I have identity in blue because this is a recurring theme since my childhood up until now of like what really frames my approach to language revitalization. And so I went through the day school there, and I was participating in Poaki when I was younger, dancing and things like that. But there was a time when I was in high school where it sort of just like fell to the background and I wasn't being as involved as I am today. And it was sort of just there, but I wasn't in it. And then I went to UNM to pursue a degree in classical guitar. And during that time, I was just doing music, and I wasn't doing anything related to Native anything. And most people in the classical music program are not Native. They're mostly white people or people from other backgrounds, but there's very few Native people in that department. And so it wasn't until the end of that degree program that I started to, I think I needed maybe electives or something. I'm not really sure what put me in that direction, but I started signing up for Native American Studies courses. And I think the first one I took was Intro to Federal Indian Law. And I had a really great professor there. His name was Bird Bear. He's a lawyer. I think he's from North Dakota. But he was a really good professor, and I started getting all of this terminology and background history of the relationship between the United States and Indigenous people. And I started to put that together with what my grandfather had been talking to me about since I was a kid. He's always been telling me to be a lawyer and all these things. He was governor at one point, and so he has a very political background, and he would talk about laws and things like that. And I never really comprehended exactly what he was talking about, and it never really made sense to me. But when I started taking this course, pieces started to fall into place, and then it started to become meaningful. And then I took Intro to, I think, Native American Studies, and I took Indian Civil Rights and a few other courses. And that really, put on a few light bulbs in my head as to, what I was missing out on. I was still into the music stuff, but, there was this whole new opportunity of things to learn and something that I was sort of starting to become passionate about learning. And so I left, I graduated, and I came back home, and I got a job with the Poe Center, which is just up the road here. And I think I was just working the front desk just as a job. I wasn't really there to pursue any kind of career or anything. But what happened was I still had this little idea in my head of wanting to learn more about these things, and I was in this museum, and now I had the opportunity to put the two together where I could start to tell other people about these things, like visitors to the museum. And so on our downtime, I would sit there and read about the history of the Pueblos or of federal Indian law and whatever. And then when people come in, I would give tours. I would start to implement that into the tours. And that was that started this process for me where I was in the front desk in the museum, then I was actually helping to set museum exhibits up and learning more about museum studies, going to conferences. And then I finally moved from the museum to where my title was historical archivist, but I had no background in history, anything other than reading about it. But basically what I was doing is researching the history and finding ways to get it out to our community and to document it and to organize things. And that's sort of where that started. And while I was there, I started sharing, and around the same time that I was in that office, I started I was sharing an office with Virgie Bigby of Tesuque Pueblo, which is one of those 6 Tewa-speaking Pueblos, and she was our Tewa language program coordinator. And we were sharing an office, and the language was something that I hadn't really touched since I was back at that day school. But then putting together what I was learning about the history and the language, it made sense. And so she sort of became a mentor to me at that time, and she would teach me things, and then I would help her put on the weekly community language nights. And basically, she was a mentor to me for about 3.5 years where I was learning Tewa, and I was helping her put these things on and seeing what the reality was of our language in terms of actually having to put the work in and then seeing what the challenges were for that. And then I'll talk about this a little later. Then after 3.5 years at the Poe Center, I moved on to my master's degree. And then finally, I came back. And so during that time when I was learning Tewa, while I was working at the Poe Center, this was sort of the format for it. It is not to say this is how I was taught by Virgie, but it's to say this is how I understood language learning to be. I had a dictionary from Okeowinge. I had a dictionary from Santa Clara, I think. and I would be like, oh, I'm gonna learn some words. What does this mean? How do you say this? And I would go through, and this means this means that. And so while there was some speaking time involved, it was my mind was set to like reading or learning how to read the language, or books, or like a good way to start to get that going. And it was a good starting point. It wasn't the best starting point. And so I was starting to accumulate a lot of nouns, lots of nouns. But I wasn't, when I would come into contact with a speaker other than Virgie, I would freeze up, and like it would be like, whoa, what are you saying? And it would just go over my head. And so I was like, man, like there's something missing here. And so I spent my time at the Post Center. I was learning as much Tewa as I could in the way I could. And then I decided I wanted to pursue an advanced degree to do more of the history stuff, but then also see what else was out there that I could bring back to the community. So I went to Arizona State University, and I was doing a master's in American Indian Studies. And I had done an internship with the National Museum of American Indian a few summers before. And they have a mailing list, and so they send out mails of like opportunities and things, and I got an email, the subject said like language revitalization in Alaska or something like that. Okay, so I click it, and then there's this organization, Where Are Your Keys? They're looking for interns for their summer intensive in Atka, Alaska. And so I'm like, I don't know what this is. I went to the website and I still didn't really know what it was. They're using sign language and they were doing other things, but I applied and I got into it. And so I went and flew to Alaska. And not only Alaska, I went to the Aleutian Islands. And so you have to go to Anchorage, you have to go to Unalaska, then you have to wait a few days for the weather to be good enough to get to Atka. So I went from the southwest, this very arid place, to this small island in the middle of the Bering Strait Ocean. And I was there for 2.5 months. And this is where I had a huge turning point in terms of going from that building up nouns and looking at the dictionary to like a very holistic approach to learning language through immersion. And so we were working with the core team there on Atka. The island, when I was there in 2016, had 60 people on the island. And the only way in and out was by plane. And the plane, I think, came once a week. So we were there, and we had this core group we had one fluent speaker that we worked with all the time, and there was a couple of others that would come during the week, and then we had a group of teenagers. And so what I was there to do was to facilitate what was happening, but also to learn the method that they were teaching. The organization is called Where Are Your Keys? That's not really what the method is called. I guess it is what it's called, but it's sort of a combination of different methods put together. And we were learning and teaching Nigugam Tunu, which is an Aleutian language. And so this is where I really started to gain the tools for immersion, and really had never been exposed to immersion before, but it was like, this is a language I had never heard, never done anything with. I didn't even know this community existed. And I was out there learning this language and getting all of these different tools that were like, wow, like I'm learning this language, and I'm actually gaining more structure in this language than my own language very early on. And a huge part of this is starting with full sentences from the very beginning. Like, not the wordless thing, but full sentences. Like when you speak to a kid, you always speak to them in full sentences, and that's how they learn. They figure it out as they go along. And so what I learned are the 3 rules for immersion are: don't use English, don't translate or explain anything no matter how strong the urge. And explain doesn't mean, you can explain, you just don't explain using English. The second one is, if you can tell what a learner is trying to say, but they're not saying the right thing, tell them what to say instead. And during the afternoon session, we're gonna do a little bit of a Where Are Your Keys introduction. And so we'll sort of learn what that is. It's called an accent adjustment. So when you're in the language, someone is saying something not correctly, you would go like this: I'm gonna give you an accent adjustment, and you say it correctly, and they know then how to say it. or can at least start to practice. And then the third rule is whenever you can, speak in simple, complete sentences like a parent would say to a 2 or 3-year-old. And I feel like this is the last rule, like the other two rules, like no translation, like that's pretty obvious, that's what immersion is. And then the accent adjustment, but the third one, complete sentences, I feel like a lot of times that's something that we, as second language learners or as teachers, don't think to implement. We think like, let's start with like, this means that, this means this, and it's just a lot of translation going on. But if you start with complete, simple sentences, you can see how quickly things can change. And so I did my internship there in Attica, Alaska. I learned a lot. I wanted to come back home after a while. It was like being on an island for 2.5 months, not going anywhere was sort of like, I needed a little break. Came back, and I went back to ASU. I was still at ASU at this time. And I had already been doing this. I was already working as an academic mentor to a cohort of Native students from Gila River Indian Reservation. And they had asked me that when you come back from Attica, Alaska, you should teach us, or try to teach us what you learned in Alaska. So we started turning it into a class. They were a cohort studying language and culture, and their classes were held on the reservation. So in addition to helping them make sure that their studies were on course, that I was starting to teach them this method, or trying to. And again, I didn't know anything about their language either, Akimel. And so what we did is like, I went in and we played what's called the setup game. It was starting to get them to think about how do you convey ideas in the language back and forth without using English. And one of those ways is through using items. How do you represent ideas that you have in your head on a table or in a picture or through miming? How do you get that message across so that the learner, so that the speaker knows what you're trying to ask for? And so we did this for a semester, and it was super challenging because I was trying to do my master's degree and I was trying to help them stay on course with their other courses, but then I was also trying to think like, how do I teach them this method that I only finished learning or starting to learn a few months ago? And so this was preparing me for my current position, which it was stressful during this time, but I was also grateful because it was working a lot of bugs out that I knew I would have to face in the future. And we didn't get as much language as we had wanted to because we only had access to 2 fluent speakers part of the week, and I really didn't have time to prepare before the class. It was like sort of like driving on the way there, like, okay, what are we gonna do today? And then I put it together and we try it and then see what happened. And so I finished my degree at Arizona State University. And I had, like I said, I had focused on language revitalization. And so what happened was I graduated, and then I went to do an internship here in Santa Fe. And then towards the summer of last year, there was the Pueblo Poake had received a state grant to carry out a language immersion, what was it called? Tribal Youth Arts and Language Immersion program. And they had asked me to be the coordinator for it. And I accepted, and it was a challenge, but I'm like, I have this wear your keys thing, and I really want to see what happens when we implement it. And it was an immersion program. The grant was for immersion. And I really wanted to see it actually be in immersion. And so what I did was, we hired 3 speakers and then 3 mentees, so people to work with the mentors, to sort of be learners. And it actually worked out really well. I got to use all of these different tools that I had, and it was a combination of implementing the wear your keys, but then also sort of being in charge of people and telling them what to do and sort of pushing my ideas forward, even though they didn't quite fully understand what I had in mind. And so I had to prepare, like, how am I going to convey this to these elders or to these fluent speakers and try to convince them that I think I know what I'm talking about. And so we did this, and a lot of the programming was already created before I was there. But what we did is we tried to incorporate language into it and and keep it as much as it was before, but then make sure that the immersion aspect was there. And so what we did was I would meet with my staff and we would practice where are your keys. I would hunt from them. Hunting is a process where I, as a learner, have something I want to learn, and I use a setup like I talked about. I create some kind of situation that gets the idea across to the speaker. What am I asking for? And so I might have this water bottle, and I'll have already learned a few questions, basic questions through translation that will get me started to get into immersion. But I would ask, "Heang namu ne'i," what is that? And then they would tell me, "Ne'i po namu." And that would get the ball rolling. That is water. And then I would ask about other things. And then we would create a situation where it's like, okay, we have, what is that? Let's ask what colors are, or let's ask what animals are, or let's ask what time of day it is. And so we created a milestone for that summer, and the milestone is sort of what informs what kind of questions are you gonna ask, what kind of setups are you gonna have to get to that milestone. And our milestone was a basic introduction like I gave just earlier. Umbi agandi. I'm gonna translate this, just so to get the idea across. Umbi agandi, with your respect. Sengi tamu, good morning. Na o toa khawe ogui. My Indian name is Roadrunner. Also wage owinge iweri omo. I'm from the Pueblo Poaki. And so we had that milestone, and instead of just having it and translating it all or having them learn it verbatim, we broke it down into lessons, each piece. So the first piece is like, okay, we want them to say Sengi Tama, which is good morning. In order to do that, we need to have them learn, how do you ask, what time of day is it? And it might not be a question you would ask, but we want them to ask so that they can get the answer. What time of day is it? Oh, it's morning time. Oh, and then you associate that with Sengi Tama, good morning. What time of day is it? Oh, it's evening. Oh, Sengi Tei, good afternoon, or good evening. And then we would go on to the next piece. What is your name? My name is this. What is his name? His name is that. What is my name? And so you sort of throw the pronoun around. So you're not just focusing on the one question you want to get the other versions of it. And then ideally, as you work through these lessons, they're working their way up to this milestone. Not only can they say the milestone, which in our case was the introduction, they have the ability to ask questions regarding other versions of it. Like if I wanted to introduce someone else. And it's giving it to them in complete sentences, there's no translation involved. And what I've learned is that learning your language and learning how to do it through immersion are two processes that you have to learn. It's one thing to learn the language, but to learn how to do it through immersion takes practice in and of itself. To stay in the language and to get your mind to switch to a place where your English brain is in the background and you're really trying to focus on using your imagination and using what tools you have to get those ideas across. And so we did things like storytelling, we had a sewing class, we tried to make it experiential. So we'd have our lesson, then we'd switch to something that was hands-on to make the language have a connection to something tangible. Storytelling, sewing of traditional clothes. We would do a prayer every morning with our cornmeal. So every time the kids would come, cornmeal would get handed to all the kids, and then we would all say a prayer together so that they got in the routine of that. And this was a pilot program. So it wasn't full on. There was still bugs in terms of staffing because we were working with the Boys and Girls Club, in terms of what their role was, and in terms of participation of the kids. Some of them would come and not come back, and then new ones would come. And that consistency really wasn't the best for teaching them what we wanted to. So we learned a lot from this program. And then we had made every single kid a name tag in their Tewa name so that we would call them by that. And I really liked that because this was like my first time back in Pewaukee over 3 years. I was at ASU for 3 years. And it was cool to see these young kids and only really know them by their Tewa name. I didn't even know their English name. And I like that because our Tewa names are seldom used sometimes. Sometimes they're only used in our kiva or for certain things. And it's like, why aren't we using these on a more daily basis? Like, I personally feel like as Tewa people, we should use our Tewa names between one another. And so I was talking about that question, Hea namu ne'i, what is that? I started to make lessons of that. And it's all in immersion. And so if someone were to see this, they would pick it up and they would be able to see what's happening and how to recreate that lesson. And one of the big things of where your keys is, it's not just learning through immersion, it's giving the learner the tools to turn around and teach what they just learned. So they are becoming a teacher almost from the very beginning. So it's not like I'm the teacher and I'm always going to be the teacher, and until you become this fluent, then you can start teaching. It's like you learn the first lesson and you practice it a few times, you can then teach that lesson. And then it allows people to move up and new people to come in and they teach that lesson, and it's always like an ongoing cycle. That's the ideal situation, and it can happen like that. That's what we did in Alaska. And it was a really cool situation. We have what's called the Fluency Freeway, and it's a grid of everyone's names who's participating in the program, and it has a list on the top of all the lessons we're creating up to the milestone. And then it has check marks for like how many times you've done that lesson, how familiar you are with it. So when people look at it and say like, I want to learn this lesson, they can find the people who are most familiar with it and who can teach them. And then literally hanging at the bottom of it is the actual lesson. So you would have these pieces of paper, so the teacher would be like, okay, I need a refresher, what's the lesson? They would get it and be like, okay. And then they would carry it out. They would get all the props, they would do whatever they have to do, and then they would carry out the lesson. And so that's a huge piece of it, is teaching, getting the speaker, the learner to teach as soon as possible. Because that's what we need. We need more speakers, but we need as many teachers as possible. And so this is more on this comes from the academic side of my time at Arizona State University. And I was writing a paper about language loss at Pewaukee and what we might do to start addressing it in a more, for lack of a better word, aggressive way. And this is a model I came across. It's by an American Indian Studies scholar, Tom Hone. And the reason he created it was sort of I think it was like as a paradigm for American Indian Studies as an academic field. But what I took it as is it encapsulated and put into a visual representation how the language fits into the person as a whole or the community as a whole. Because oftentimes when we have a field we work in, we sort of stay in that field and we're like good at it and we sort of stay in there. But for me, it was like, how do I make the language relevant? How do you build passion for the language? And to me, this is what sort of helped get it in my head of like, the language is not just this thing by itself, it's connected to all these other things. And that's how Indigenous life is, Pueblo life. And when you really think about it, when one of these goes away, eventually the other pieces will start to go away as well. They all support one another and they all inform one another. And unfortunately, our languages are one of the most threatened aspects of this thing. Over time, a lot of us have lost land, and because of that, we can't carry out certain ceremonies, and because of colonization and boarding schools, our languages have been greatly diminished. But at least from a Pueblo perspective, the language seems to be the thing that's most threatened. And so I'm coming at it from the language point of view. And the way I see it, like going back to that slide of talking about identity, of how I was questioning my identity when I was back at that day school, when my identity was being questioned, to the way I've begun to understand this model is that it's really talking about identity. When you are an Indigenous person and you're from a specific community and you have a specific culture and a specific land base and way of doing things, all of those things inform your identity. And they tell you who you are and what your values are and what your responsibilities are. And so what I've done through my work is I've started to expand on this model to make more sense of it. Like, I feel like there's more pieces to this, and I benefit a lot from these types of visual representations because it encapsulates like bigger ideas, but it helps me to convey them to someone else without writing a book about it, you know? And so what I've started to work on is like the idea of you have this peoplehood model. You have language, history, place, territory, and ceremonial cycle. And I see it as rather than just a stagnant thing that's there, it's like a process, especially for those of us who are second language learners or who are trying to revitalize our cultures. The way I've come to understand it for myself, and that makes sense for me, is that as you participate in these various aspects of this peoplehood model, you learn your history, you're learning your language, you learn about your land base, what's on it, and you go to ceremonies and you are a participant in that, you are experiencing those things and you're learning those things. And what goes along with the experience is what has been referred to as the process of becoming. And I'm not exactly sure where this term came from. I think I first heard it from someone named Tessie Naranjo, who's from Santa Clara Pueblo. She writes about some things like this. And the way I've defined it for myself is the process of becoming is that process in which you as an individual or a community is working toward the best version of itself within the context of its culture. And so as you gain experience in these different realms, you gain experience, you are by default going through the process of becoming, trying to be that thing that you see out there. And as that process happens, this goes back to your identity. You gain experience and you know more about these things, but then your identity becomes stronger because you have tangible connections to these things now. You've been there. You can tell people what these things mean. You can start to teach these things. And that informs your intention, like, okay, now I have this knowledge and my identity is becoming more, is becoming strengthened, it's becoming clearer. What are my intentions now? So yesterday was talked about being a speaker, but then being a user of the language. If you're a speaker, that's awesome. But then what are your intentions with the language? Ideally, it's to teach the language as well, not just to speak it, but to teach it. And so, especially in today's climate of like DNA tests and things like that, I feel like intention is a huge thing. There's a lot of people who do DNA tests and they find out they're native. And that's great, but then what is your intention of that? Are you going to start learning about your culture? Or are you just going to tell people what your test results said? And so another aspect of this is, and this is a big piece for me, and it's been brought up several times in terms of how do you foster motivation or passion for the language. And I don't have any one answer for that. To me, it's more of a larger approach of like, how do you start to build relationships between those individuals and these various aspects of who we are as Indigenous people? For instance, like I didn't hear the language at all growing up. I heard it when I was at that day school, but a real relationship to it I never really had. And it wasn't until I started to make relationships with people who already had those relationships that I and I could identify with them, and I could identify with our shared culture. So like, there's those 6 Tewa-speaking pueblos. We're distinct pueblos with our own governments. We're our own people. But we are all relatives. We share the same language. We have very similar cultures and very similar ways of doing things. And that goes for all the pueblos. And so to me, it's like, how do you start building relationships between people and these things? And the only way to do it is to expose people to it and to invite them and for them to see what it is. And then ideally, they start to go through this process of experiencing, their identity builds up, they have the intention to do something hopefully positive with what they've learned, and that automatically makes it so they are building a relationship with these things. And then that goes back, and intention is sort of offshoots to action or expression. Like you have a lot of Native artists who do political work, or you have Native artists who make traditional jewelry, or you have poets, or you have people who go into law school because of the things they've learned about their history. They know that if they don't learn about their history and get a law degree, they can't protect the land or the language or those other things. And so this is the point I'm at, and this is what makes sense for me in terms of like, how do I see the bigger picture of this thing moving and what my role in it is, and ideally what we can do to try to get other people to build relationships with these things and become motivated and hopefully become passionate about being a learner of any of these things, but in this context, language. And so when I was doing those Native American Studies courses at UNM, that started to, like I said, it put together things that I had experienced in my own life, things my grandfather had talked to me about, with actual historical facts of what has happened to Indigenous people and under the government of the US and other governments as well. And so when I went into American Indian Studies, it really put into perspective that we didn't just get here by accident. We didn't just lose our languages one day and because we got lazy or something. There was a very intentional effort to make us not indigenous. Very violent, very thorough. And so for me, it's imperative that people who are learning the language and taking part in this process are also learning about the process of colonization and what things have happened from the outside to us on the inside. And not to use it as a way of like feeling sorry for ourselves or this happened, but as a way to resist. And as a way to say, actually, I'm gonna think about it this way instead of this way because I know that dominant culture wants me to think this way, but what does my culture say I should think about this? And this is just, like colonization to me was like, oh, people came here and they did a bunch of bad things. But for me, this simple definition really helps me connect it to more realistic things that I can see in the world. So colonization is the planting of colonies outside of a nation's own land base. For instance, the Spanish came from Spain and they create colonies here. Or the English came from England, they create colonies here. But they can't sustain themselves just by being here. They need resources to live. And so back in the day, those resources were in the form of the encomienda system here in the pueblos, where the pueblos had to give up a certain amount of what they had made to the encomendador, the person in charge of taking all these things, and it was in exchange for protection from other tribes. At least that's what they say. But in order to have that exchange of goods, you don't just ask Native people, give me your stuff. You sort of have to force them to do it because it's not an equal exchange. And so that's where you get the suppression and manipulation of indigenous populations in order to better access those resources. And we see that today with oil extraction, fracking, companies trying to come onto native land to extract resources. It always comes back to extracting resources, and the thing standing in the way of the companies and the government are indigenous people, because this has always been our land. And I feel like this is really important to understand as an indigenous person, because it sort of lights that fire to where it's not just, I want to do this because it makes me feel good inside, but it's like, I want to do this because it's a matter of survival. And it really is. Even though we are not in the same situation that a lot of our ancestors were in, we're still in a situation that's dire in terms of our abilities to survive and the ability of our cultures to survive. And so this is just another representation of that. It's sort of hard to think like, I know when I go places anywhere in the US, I think like who lives here now, who used to live here. And when you think of the massive scale of land loss that we've had, it's like unimaginable. And it's no wonder that our cultures and languages and things are under threat as well. The only way to, what I've learned is that the US didn't just straight up murder native people because frankly it costs too much to do that. They found it more economically feasible to send them to boarding school and make them not Indian anymore. And so by doing that, you are intentionally ripping that relationship apart. This relationship that we now need to rebuild, right? And that's what assimilation is. And when you have people who identify more with dominant culture than their own indigenous culture, it's a lot easier to take their things from them because they don't know the importance anymore, because they don't have that system anymore of like, what is my relationship to this and why do I need to protect it? And so this was forced removal, treaties being not held up, all of these different reasons that we've lost our land. And so for me, this is learning these types of things and understanding these at a fundamental level is, for me, the piece where critical thinking comes into play, which graduate school really gave to me. Graduate school is a Western thing, but what we have to do, what I found is we have to go in there and be critical of it and take the tools that are useful for us, but then also say what things need to be changed about this institution, because it's still a colonizing institution. They still think in the dominant way, and you sort of have to adapt to them to come to them. But you have to, if you're able to think critically about it, you can stay who you are, come back home, and do what you need to do, but also gaining those tools from that place. And so when we take the peoplehood model and you take our own indigenous values, our own indigenous worldview, and you put that together with critical thinking, you have this ability to move in the world in a way that is defined by you rather than someone else. And so I put language is as identity. Language revitalization is about relationship reformation, because we had those relationships at one point. They need to be reformed. And the strengthening of identity. And so like I talked about that peoplehood model, it goes beyond language, and it talks about how learners and the community need to know, that they need to know things beyond just the language. And then there's a journal article written by Brian Brayboy. He's Lumbee, and he works at ASU, and I had come across one of his articles once. It's called Toward a Tribal Critical Race Theory in Education. And so he was writing about this theory that he wanted to put out there for people to consider about when you think about Native people in the education system. And so it has 9 tenets. And so like the first tenet is colonization is endemic to society. The second one is US policies towards indigenous peoples are rooted in imperialism, white supremacy, and a desire for material gain. And then the one that I was most interested in regarding language and culture is the fifth one. The concepts of culture, knowledge, and power take on new meaning when examined through an indigenous lens. And so what he talks about, and I'll read this from the actual article, is knowledge is defined by tribal crit, which is tribal critical race theory, as the ability to recognize change, adapt, and move forward with the change. There are at least 3 forms of knowledge that tribal crit addresses, and they exist in accord with one another. The first is cultural knowledge. Cultural knowledge is an understanding of what it means to be a member of a particular tribal nation. This includes particular traditions, issues, and ways of being and knowing that make an individual a member of a community. That's cultural knowledge. Knowledge of survival includes an understanding of how and in what ways change can be accomplished and the ability and willingness to change, adapt, and adjust in order to move forward as an individual and community. And then finally, the third is academic knowledge. Academic knowledge is that acquired from educational institutions. In many of our communities, this is often referred to as book knowing or book smarts. And then he goes on to say, while indigenous ways of knowing and book smarts are often seen as diametrically opposed, meaning they can't come together, these different forms of knowledge are not necessarily in conflict. Rather, they complement one another in powerful ways. The blending of knowledges, academic and cultural ones, creates knowledge that is key to survival. And that's sort of what I'm going back to of, we have our peoplehood model. These are the things that come from our communities. But because we live in a colonized world, it's necessary that we know these other things as well. And a lot of this stuff comes from academic knowledge. And there's a lot of indigenous scholars who talk about these things. So it's not just non-natives telling us what to think about these things, but it's native people who have thought about these things, go to the academic institutions and write about them. And then it says, this strategic use of multiple forms of knowledge generates power that is situated, dynamic, and historically influenced. Power is not a property or trait that an individual has to exercise to control others. Rather, it is rooted in a group's ability to define themselves, their place in the world, and their traditions. Power through an indigenous lens is an expression of sovereignty, defined as self-determination, self-government, self-identification, and self-education. In this way, sovereignty is community-based. So I really like that because it puts into perspective, we need to learn our languages in order to keep these other aspects of who we are from going away and from our ability to be a community from going away. But we also need to learn our languages because this form of knowledge, coupled with our ability to know the outside world of knowledge that isn't necessarily our own, but that allows us to adapt and survive, is what gives us our sovereignty. And so sovereignty it's talked about all the time in Native communities. And sometimes I think it's hard to define, but for me and sort of what Brayboy talks about, it's our ability to make decisions for ourselves in our own interests, rather than someone telling us what decisions we should be making. And then this goes back to the title of my presentation, Talk in it, not about it. That's referring to immersion. I know a lot of times when I was learning Tewa from the beginning, I would talk a lot about like, oh, I wonder what this is. And like you think of all these like ideas of how cool the language is, but you're not actually speaking in it. And so immersion is the way to actually be in the language. But in addition to being in the language and looking back at that peoplehood model, my personal belief is that you have to be taking part in those other aspects of what that peoplehood model showed. You have to be participating in ceremonial activities. You have to learn your history, the traditional history, but also the Western history of colonization. You have to learn about your land base. And I'm trying to put this into practice for myself. I'm not just trying to stand up here and talk about it as a theory. So for instance, right now I'm trying to pursue a certificate as a master naturalist in northern New Mexico, and that is giving me a whole new perspective on land. And it's not native people teaching it, but it's giving me a good basis for where to start. And then I could come back to our native elders and Tewa elders and ask them about these things, and then putting those two forms together of knowledge, the cultural knowledge and the academic knowledge. So I wrote, those doing this need to be also doing that. Those doing the language also need to be taking traditional courses in our traditional arts. They also need to be taking courses in Native American studies. And it's not to say they need to get degrees in all these things, but they need to have some kind of foundation in these different areas of ways of knowing. And so for another example, I did the Indigenous, the Pueblo food experience. And that was through the Institute, the Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute, which is run by Roxanne Swinzel, who's from Santa Clara Pueblo. And that was an experiment where she got a group of people together, Tewa people, and we ate only traditional foods, pre-contact foods for 3 months straight. And I was part of the second cohort to do this. And it was a really cool experience because it makes you more familiar with the foods that your ancestors actually ate, but it also has huge health benefits. And so this was a way for me to start to learn about that. As we know, our diets are fully colonized diets. When we go, it's very hard. You have to go out of your way to find anything that's indigenous to what we eat. It's very easy to eat foods that are from other places that are highly processed. And so that was just another example of trying to be in different areas and different forms of learning, but that are all tied together. And then another example is I've taken several classes at the Post Center. They offer traditional arts classes. And when I had got back, I had already taken some courses there, but when I got back from ASU, I took Black on Black Pottery with Eric Fender, who's from San Ildefonso. And this is where I started to ask questions in Tewa. What is that? What am I doing? What are you doing? And it was cool because he's not a language teacher, but he got after a few sessions of doing it in the language, he got what I was trying to do. He knew not to translate, and he knew that it was more about the setup and making the situation conducive to learning what we were trying to learn. So quickly, as a director, these are the different things I have to think about. Like I talked about, I'm the director of our Tewa language department. I'm trying to take a very holistic approach to our department. Rather than just teaching, I need to think about what informs our teaching. Why are we doing this whole thing in the first place? To me, that's what the peoplehood model represents. The wear your keys method is like, that's the tool I have right now to use. There's a lot of tools out there, but the only way to get those tools is to go find what they are, go try different things, do internships, come to conferences like this. You have to go out and find what works for you. I have to think about the speakers that I work with. How am I going to utilize their time best? The core group of learners, I'm not trying to cast a wide net and teach every single person in my community. I'm trying to focus on those people who seem to be inherently passionate about the language or who want to learn, who keep coming back, because I'm trying to create more examples in the community so that the crowd gets larger. A committee of language specialists, learners, speakers to help guide where we're going. A huge one that isn't often brought up is policy. How can the tribal government or the tribal council shift the direction of the community? If we have something we want to do, we can, the tribal language department can help do that and facilitate it, but we can only do so much. If it comes from the leadership, then it's like everyone is on the same page and we're all starting to move in the same direction. Then there's also things like curriculum, programming, evaluation, which is a big one, and expansion. How do we get the language in other domains within the Pueblo? And so putting all these things together, at this point, I'm starting to think of like, how do I create a master plan for the direction of our department? What is the vision for our language as a community? What is our vision? This is where tribal leadership comes in, but then also the committee and other people, other stakeholders from the community. Where do we want to see our language at this point in time? Okay, we want to see this many fluent speakers and this happening in this X amount of years. Now, what are the steps to getting there? We can't just teach our language and hope one day everyone will be fluent. We need to have a very systematic way of getting there, trying to do it at least. And getting everyone to think on the same page, we need to educate our leaders, we need to educate our council people as to what it really looks like on the ground to be in the language program. So invite your leadership to your language program. Make them sit down and do a lesson. And so just as some resources, these are some books that I've come across that I have found helpful. How to Keep Your Language Alive. I like that one. It's very, very to the point and a very accessible way of implementing immersion. In particular, it's talking about the master apprentice approach, but there's a lot of good tools in there and ideas. The Becoming Fluent one it's an approach to language through cognitive science. What is the science behind learning a language? To me, it gave me a lot of terminology for things that I had experienced but didn't have names for. For Indigenous eyes only, that's a really good introduction for decolonization, understanding colonization, different ways to, so for instance, it has a chapter in there about language and about enrollment. What are some ways of thinking about what is it to be a member of a community? Is it just blood quantum? Is it just relationships? Or is it actually knowing these cultural things and carrying them on? And then this book is super expensive, but it has a lot of good information in it. Where Your Keys has a chapter, I think Ine has a chapter in it. And it's from all over the world. It talks about policy, and so what I would recommend is see if you can enter library, or what is it called, where you get it from another library, if they don't have it at your library, and check it out before you get any of these books. And then some resources online. First Peoples Cultural Council, if you just look that up, there's a lot of really, really good resources on there. They're based out of British Columbia, Vancouver. They have things about assessments, they have things about fact sheets that help you in a sort of snapshot, understand what immersion is, understand all of these different concepts that we deal with on a daily basis. Can-do statements is an assessment through ACTFL, which is the American Council of the Teaching of Foreign Languages. That one, they're a little bit hard to find, but it's basically a self-checklist of how fluent you are. And that's something I didn't talk about too much, but knowing how fluent you are or your proficiency in a language is huge, because I didn't really know how fluent I was, and sometimes people will come to me thinking I'm fluent just because I speak more than them, but that's not true at all. So when you know your fluency level, novice, intermediate, advanced, or superior, you have a much better idea of what you can give, but also where you need to go. And there's an Indigenous created assessment, the lower one, I think it's called the Language Learning Assessment Tool. There's a mailing list called Indigenous Languages and Technology through the U of A. If you look that up, you'll see that there's an email that you could send, and you can be on their mailing list. They send out stuff all the time about revitalization efforts all over the country. And sometimes there's some really good opportunities. I went to a linguistic conference, totally paid for in New York City this past year just because of an email from there. And then listening playlists. This is something that you would create on your own. You create CDs or audio recordings of fluent speakers speaking about anything you want. And this is used to fill up the airwaves for learners who don't have speakers at home. And when they're on a long drive, they need to get those sounds and those rhythms in their ear. And this is what I play for myself and my son all the time. And I notice that I start to get better ideas of what's being said, but also how it flows, but then I start to actually understand what is being said, even though that's not the real intention. It's not to know what they're saying, it's more to see how they're saying it. If you're local, look into the New Mexico Tribal Language Consortium. And so that's another way of networking. We're a small grassroots group that works to help Native communities working on their languages. So look that up, and we have different meetings that are open to everyone. Sometimes we'll put on our own symposiums. And then very, very quickly, when you're working with outside groups, you need to be, what I have found, you need to be cognizant of what their intentions are. Sometimes people might have good tools, what seem like good tools, but their intentions might be more to make money than to really give you something that is sustainable. So always think about people over products. Are they there to build up the capacity of your ability to do your work, or are they there to make a bunch of products and then leave you and you have all this material that you don't know what to do with? So that's something just to think about. Making connections, get out there, network. These are just some of my influences. My great-great-grandfather who went to Carlisle. From what I've heard, he spoke 4 languages, Tewa, Spanish, and English. All of those fluent speakers up there have been mentors to me in some way or another. My little son, Makoa, and other people who I wasn't able to get a picture of, my mom and some other people that have supported me, mentored me. Those are the people that I do these things for. Kudoa.